He heard the insult. His manager begged him to respond. James Brown looked at him and said 3 words, "Watch me work." It was 1965, and the music world was watching 2 men circle each other like fighters who had never agreed to a fight. One had been screaming his name from the top of every hill for years, telling anyone who would listen that he had built everything. The moves, the sound, the fire, all of it. The other had said nothing. Not a single word, not a press release, not an interview quote, not even a rumor passed through a side door. Just silence. And then, the stage. But to understand why that silence was so devastating, you have to go back to the beginning. You have to go back to a Georgia church, a dirt road, and 2 boys who would one day stand on opposite sides of the same throne. Richard Wayne Penniman was born on December 5, 1932, in Macon, Georgia. He was one of 12 children in a family that barely had enough to eat. His father sold bootleg whiskey and was shot dead outside a nightclub when Richard was still a teenager. By the time Richard was 13, he was living on the street, surviving by selling food at a bus station. He slept in doorways, in cars, wherever a body could rest without being moved along. He had nothing except a voice, and that voice was unlike anything anyone had ever heard. When Richard sat down at a piano, something happened that defied easy explanation. The notes were too fast, the rhythm too violent, the screams too raw for what most people called music. Churches rejected him. His own family was embarrassed by the spectacle he made of himself. He wore makeup on stage. He pounded keyboards like he was trying to break them in half. He stood up, sat down, stood up again, wailed from some place so deep inside himself that audiences did not know whether to cheer or run. In 1955, he recorded a song called Tutti Frutti that would split the history of popular music into 2 halves, before and after. The world had never heard anything like it, but the world did not always give Richard the credit he deserved. The music industry in the United States of America in the 1950s had a mechanism it used to soften the sound of black artists before delivering it to white audiences. A white singer named Pat Boone recorded a smooth, bloodless version of Tutti Frutti and outsold Richard's original by a factor that should have embarrassed everyone involved. It did not embarrass anyone involved. That was simply how the industry worked. Richard watched his music get laundered through a more acceptable face, and the money and the praise flowed away from him toward someone who had not written a single word of the song. This wound never fully healed. Richard carried it through every decade that followed, and it shaped the way he talked about his place in history. He was not wrong to be angry. He had invented something real, something that cracked the foundation of what popular music could be. But the anger, over time, began to look for targets in places it perhaps should not have reached. James Joe Brown Jr. was born on May 3, 1933, in Barnwell, South Carolina. The circumstances of his early life were so severe that when people read about them, they sometimes assume they are reading exaggeration. They are not. His parents separated when he was 4 years old. His father left him with an aunt who ran what his neighbors described as a house of prostitution in Augusta, Georgia. He wore clothes made from potato sacks to school. He was sent home from school more than once because his clothes were considered too ragged and too indecent for the other children to see. He shined shoes. He picked cotton. He danced on the street corner for coins thrown by strangers. He was arrested for breaking into cars when he was 16 years old and sentenced to 8 to 16 years in a Georgia reform institution called the Alto Reform School. Inside that institution, James Brown made 2 decisions that would define the rest of his life. The first decision was that he would never be poor again. Not in the way he had been poor, and where the poverty was visible on your body and announced itself before you even opened your mouth. The second decision was that he would find a way out through music. He had been singing since he could speak. He had been feeling rhythm in his body since before he could name what rhythm was. In prison, he formed a gospel quartet. He practiced every day. He sang with the kind of focused intensity that people who have no other options tend to bring to the one thing they have left. He was paroled in 1952 at 19 years old, and he walked out of that institution with nothing except the determination of someone who has already survived the worst and decided it will not happen again. By the mid-1950s, James Brown had joined a group called the Famous Flames, and they were playing small clubs and theaters on what was called the Chitlin Circuit, the network of black-owned venues across the American South and East, where black performers could play without facing the humiliation of segregated dressing rooms and hostile white audiences. These were not glamorous venues. These were places where the electricity sometimes cut out mid-song, where the floors were sticky and the pay was unreliable and the drive between cities felt endless. But James Brown was learning something in every one of those rooms. He was learning what a body can do on a stage. He watched the audience. He watched their feet, their hands, their faces. He noticed what made them lean forward and what made them settle back. He understood, earlier than almost anyone, that a concert was not just a performance of songs, it was a physical event. It was something that happened to a body, not just to ears. And he began to build a vocabulary of movement that had no precedent. The cape routine, the splits, the way he would collapse to one knee and then rise in a single motion that looked impossible at full speed, the way he would work the microphone stand like it was a conversation partner, leaning into it and pulling away and spinning it and catching it at the last second before it fell. He built his band the way a general builds an army. Every member of the Famous Flames knew that being late cost them money. A missed note cost them money. A wrinkled shirt cost them money. James Brown ran his band with a code of discipline that no one who joined it had ever experienced before. Some musicians quit because they could not stand the pressure. Others stayed for decades because they understood that the pressure was the point. The pressure was what produced the thing that no other band in the world could produce. By the early 1960s, James Brown was beginning to accumulate a reputation that extended beyond the Chitlin Circuit. He was being called the hardest working man in show business, and this was not merely a promotional phrase. He was playing over 300 shows per year. He was recording constantly. He was refining and refining and refining his live performance until every moment of every set was controlled with a precision that more closely resembled choreography than improvisation. And then came the night that changed everything. In October of 1962, James Brown recorded a live album at the Apollo Theater in Harlem, New York. The record company did not want to release it. They told him that live albums did not sell. He believed in it so strongly that he financed part of the recording himself. When it was released in 1963, it became one of the best-selling records in the United States of America and stayed on the charts for 66 weeks. James Brown had not just recorded a live album, he had documented a phenomenon. And now the whole country knew his name. This was the context in which Little Richard began to say what he said. It started quietly, the way these things often do, a comment in an interview, a remark backstage that made its way to a reporter. Richard would say that James Brown had taken his style, taken his energy, taken his way of moving on a stage, and called it his own. He would say that before James Brown there was Richard, that without Richard there would be no James, that the footwork, the screaming, the raw physicality of the performance, all of it came from him, and that the world had simply forgotten to notice. The music press loved it. Conflict between black artists and a segregated music industry that had already stolen from both of them was exactly the kind of story that filled column inches and sold papers. Reporters would ask Richard about James, and Richard would deliver. He was not a man who struggled to find words. His words came fast, and they came loud, and they carried the authority of genuine conviction. He had been saying his whole life that he did not receive the recognition he deserved, and now he had a specific target for that complaint. By the mid-1960s, Richard was not only implying that James Brown had borrowed from him, he was stating it directly. He would sit in front of television cameras and radio microphones and say, without qualification, that James Brown had stolen his act. He would say that James Brown would not exist without him. He would say that the world owed Richard Penniman a debt it was paying to the wrong man. James Brown's manager at the time was a man named Ben Bart, who had been with him since the early days and who understood the music business well enough to know that silence could be either a weakness or a weapon, depending on who wielded it and when. When the Richard comments first began circulating, Ben Bart went to James Brown and told him they needed to respond. A denial, a counter-narrative, and something that placed James Brown's version of events on the record before Richard's version became the only one. James Brown listened. He sat quietly while Ben Bart laid out the argument. And then he said 3 words. "Watch me work." That was all. 3 words. No press release was drafted. No interview was scheduled. No radio call-in was arranged. James Brown went back to rehearsal. He went back to the stage. He went back to the only conversation he had ever trusted to carry the truth of who he was. What people who knew James Brown in this period say about him is consistent. He did not believe in verbal arguments. He believed in evidence. And the evidence was always the same. Get on the stage and make it impossible for anyone in the room to think about anyone else. The year 1965 was extraordinary by any measure. And James Brown released Papa's Got a Brand New Bag, a song that did not merely advance rhythm and blues. It created a new genre. What he did with that recording was compress the rhythm so tightly, push the beat so far forward, strip the melody down to something almost skeletal, that the result was something no one had a name for yet. They would eventually call it funk. The word would take a few years to settle, but the thing itself existed from the moment that record was pressed. Papa's Got a Brand New Bag reached number 8 on the pop chart in the United States of America and reached number 1 on the rhythm and blues chart. It won James Brown his first Grammy Award, the Recording Academy's most prestigious honor, for Best Rhythm and Blues Recording. He accepted the award without mentioning Little Richard. He accepted it without mentioning anyone who had questioned him. He walked up, accepted the trophy, thanked the people he needed to thank, and went back to work. But the story does not end with a Grammy. The story ends, or perhaps better to say it, arrives at its most revealing moment in a series of live performances from the same period that people who witnessed them still talk about in terms that sound like they are describing a natural event rather than a concert. James Brown's live performances in 1965 and 1966 have been described by musicians, critics, and audience members as something that existed outside the normal categories of experience. He was playing shows that lasted 3 hours and left the entire audience physically exhausted. He was doing the splits in shoes that cost more than some people in the audience earned in a week. He was collapsing to the stage and rising again with a timing so perfect it looked like it had been engineered by a machine. The cape routine, which his valet would drape over his shoulders as though he were a man being helped off the floor after a collapse, and which James Brown would then dramatically shrug off to reveal that he was not done, never done. The night was never over until he decided it was over. This routine was not choreographed in the way a Broadway show is choreographed. It was improvised every single night from a deep reserve of instinct and training so internalized that the distinction between the two had disappeared. Little Richard was watching. The music world was watching. And what the music world saw was a man who did not need to say a word, because every word that needed to be said was being communicated in a language that could not be misquoted, could not be taken out of context, could not be softened or reframed by an editor who wanted a cleaner story. There is a thing that happens in a rivalry when one of the two people involved refuses to engage on the terms the other has set. The one who refuses gains a kind of power that cannot be earned any other way. By staying silent, James Brown was doing something that Richard's vocal campaign could not touch. He was refusing to place the argument on the level where words live. He was pulling it down to the level where only one thing matters. What do you do when the lights come on? And on that level, the conversation was already over. And there were people in the industry who agreed with Richard. Not in public, most of them, because the business of picking sides in a dispute between two men of that stature was a business that cost you relationships you could not afford to lose. But privately, there were musicians who said yes, you could hear Richard and James. The screaming, the breathless, feverish quality of the vocal delivery, the sense that at any moment the performer might throw himself completely off the edge of what a body was supposed to be able to sustain. These were things Richard had done first. There was truth in what he was saying, but there is a difference between influence and theft, and that difference is what you do with what you have received. Every musician who has ever lived has heard something in someone else and felt it change the way they thought about their own work. That is not theft. That is how music moves through time. The question is never where something came from. The question is what you built with it. What James Brown built with whatever he had absorbed from Richard, from the church, from the street corners, from the prison choir, from 300 nights a year on a Chitlin Circuit stage, was something that did not sound like its origins. It sounded like James Brown. It sounded like something that had been burned down to its most essential elements and rebuilt from the ground up by someone who could not afford to waste a single note on anything that was not completely, devastatingly itself. The years passed. Richard's insistence on the narrative of theft softened at times and sharpened at others, depending on the moment and the audience. He would occasionally speak warmly of James, acknowledging the talent, the work ethic, the sheer force of the man's will. And then he would return to the grievance because the grievance was real, even if its specific target was debatable. Richard had been robbed. Not necessarily by James Brown, but by an industry and a culture that had taken his creation and passed it through whiter hands before they would celebrate it. That robbery was real. The anger it produced was justified. James Brown understood this because James Brown had been robbed in some of the same ways. But understanding someone's anger does not mean stepping into its path and letting it define you. In 1971, at a concert in Atlanta, Georgia, both men were in the same city on the same night. The details of what happened before and after the show are less important than what happened during it. James Brown took the stage at a venue packed with people who had come from hundreds of miles away. He played for 3.5 hours. By the end of it, people in the front rows were crying, not because the songs were sad, because of the sheer accumulation of what they had witnessed, because of the way a human being who had been poor enough to wear potato sacks to school, a human being who had been locked in a reform institution at 16, a human being who had been told in 100 different ways that people like him did not belong on a stage like this, had taken everything that had ever tried to stop him and turned it into this, and into a force of pure will and rhythm and presence that left no room in the building for doubt about who he was. Richard heard about it. Of course he heard about it. And what people who were close to Richard say about that period is that he went quieter on the subject of James Brown for a while after that. Not permanently. The remarks resumed eventually, in one form or another. But for a time, the volume came down. There are things that silence communicates that words cannot. Words can be argued with. Words can be picked apart and reassembled into something that means almost the opposite of what was intended. Words can be dismissed as self-promotion, or defensiveness, or score-settling. But a performance like what James Brown gave on the stages of the mid-1960s and beyond was not a statement that could be argued with. It was evidence. It was the kind of evidence that accumulates over years into something so large that eventually even the people who wanted to dispute it had to step back and acknowledge what was in front of them. James Brown never said, "I am the hardest working man in show business." His team said it. His promotional materials said it. But James Brown did not need to say it because every night in city after city he proved it beyond the reach of any counter-argument. He never said, "My influence is my own." He never needed to explain where his style came from or defend its origins or draw a line between what he had taken and what he had invented. Because the thing he was doing on that stage was so completely and recognizably his, so stamped with his particular obsession with rhythm and control and physical extremity, that it could not be mistaken for a copy of anything. You cannot copy something to this degree. You cannot take someone else's fire and burn it this hot. At some point, the heat is your own. Watch me work. 3 words. Not a rebuttal. Not a defense. An instruction. An arrow pointing not at the argument, but at the answer. Watch. Me. Work. And the world watched. And the world saw. By the time James Brown died on December 25, 2006 in Atlanta, Georgia, at 73 years old, the argument about influence and theft had long since been absorbed into something larger. His legacy was not a question of what he had borrowed. His legacy was what every musician who came after him had borrowed from him. The list of artists who named James Brown as a foundational influence reads like a map of the last 60 years of popular music. George Clinton, Prince, Michael Jackson, every producer who ever placed a drum loop at the center of a track and built a song around the groove rather than the melody. Every dancer who ever understood that the body moving in time to rhythm was not decoration, but the message itself. Every performer who understood that a concert is not a recitation of songs, but a physical covenant between a stage and a room full of people who have agreed, for those hours, to surrender completely to whatever is happening in front of them. Little Richard outlived James Brown by nearly 14 years. He died on May 9, 2020, at 87 years old. In the years between James Brown's death and his own, Richard spoke about his old rival with a complexity that the simple theft narrative had never captured. He acknowledged the greatness. Then he acknowledged the work. He returned sometimes to the complaint. But increasingly what came through in his words about James Brown was not anger, but something closer to recognition. The recognition of one extraordinary life for another. 2 men from the deepest poverty the American South could produce. 2 men who clawed their way from nothing to something so visible that the whole world knew their names. 2 men whose argument in the end was not really about who invented what. It was about something more human than that. It was about wanting to be seen, wanting the credit, wanting the world to understand what it cost to make something from nothing when nothing was genuinely what you started with. Richard said it in words, because words were how Richard fought. James Brown said it in the only language he had ever fully trusted, and he walked onto the stage. He grabbed the microphone. He said, "Watch me work," and for 3.5 hours in city after city, year after year, decade after decade, that is exactly what he did. The silence was never empty. The silence was the loudest thing in the room.